Over the last few months, we've uncovered some of the darkest hidden meanings behind some of the most iconic movies. Some people agreed, and others absolutely hated these theories. But today, instead of just looking at one movie, we're diving into 5 of my biggest theories, from Coraline, Paranoman, 9, and even Where the Wild Things Are. So grab a snack, sit back, and let's see these movies in a completely different way. What if 9 and the other Stitchpunks were never meant to survive? As there is a lot of unanswered questions I have with the scientist's end goal, and even why the machine has a slot for the talisman, left with 9 that powers it back on. And after watching this movie on repeat for some time and looking closely, I have a theory about it all. But before we go and cause the apocalypse, hit that subscribe button. Let's not let the machines take over. In the movie 9, we go through a journey in a post-apocalyptic world as each of the 9 Stitchpunks try to survive as humanity's last hope. At the beginning of the film, when 9, the 9th Stitchpunk, I know the name's very fitting, first wakes up, he grabs a device we later learn through the film is a talisman that can transfer the souls and or fractions of a soul from humans and the Stitchpunks and either keep it inside of it or transfer it to something else. 9 then ventures out and finds 2, another Stitchpunk of the 9 created, and this is where the first encounter with the robots that ended humanity happened, as a cat-like robot finds them, and then 2 is ultimately taken away along with the talisman. Then, 5 spots 9 through a spyglass after 9 collapse, and 5 takes him back to their hideout, where we also then meet 1, 8, and 6. And after finding out what happened to 2, 1 suggests that they stay, but 9 and 5 decide to go looking for him, and they ultimately find him along with the beast from before, and as they are escaping with 2, the beast notices and almost catches them, but then 7 arrives and defeats the beast, but what comes next is what I want to focus on. As 9 finds the talisman again, he looks at it, as well as there seems to be a spot for it on a machine we later learned that the scientist who made the Stitchpunks and this talisman also made. 9 then unknowingly connects it to the machine, and it powers up and ultimately sucks up the soul of 2. The others are then forced to leave him behind, and they follow 7 to where she and the twins are, 3 and 4. But I have a few problems with what just happened, because if we go towards the middle and end of the film, after learning more about the history of the war from the twins, they show news about what went down before the events of the film. We see a political figure announcing the robot we see 9 power on. It was actually being used as a weapon for advanced warfare that ultimately turned sour and turned against humanity. And then closer to the end of the film, when 9 travels back to where the movie began, we finally hear the scientist's message he left for 9, and the message goes something like this. It had such promise, my machine. It was meant to be an instrument of progress, of creation. That was the agreement our Chancellor failed to honor, though the fault is hardly his alone to bear. The machine was born purely of my intellect, which I now know was not enough. My creation was hopelessly flawed, and indeed dangerous, for it lacked the human soul, and could be easily corrupted by those who controlled it. That is why I'm making each of you, referring to 9 and the other Stitchpunks, you are all that's left of humanity. You are all the pieces of my soul. And there is a lot to unpack from this speech, but now we know he didn't make the machine with the intent of harm. Instead, he made it as a reflection of his intelligence. But if we take the line, for it lacked a human soul, there's something that I think he did. Because if we take a look at the talisman, it serves multiple uses. Because looking at the flashback of the machine, it isn't using the talisman. Instead, the scientist is plugged into the machine, enabling the machine to copy his intellect. So what if sometime in between and looking at some sketches he has in his room regarding the robot, he made the talisman to give the machine the one thing it lacked, a human soul. But what does this mean for the 9 Stitchpunks, and why did he split his soul? And also, what does each Stitchpunk represent? Well, continuing through the film, as we learn more about each of the Stitchpunks and their personalities, we can make some assumptions of which part of the scientist's soul they are. Starting from 1, from the second we meet 1, he attains the role of leadership and authority, and that's fitting as he was the first ever Stitchpunk. We also learn he is afraid and will do anything to survive, so we can assume he reflects the instincts for caution, fear, and protection as he tries to survive. We also learn that 1 through 8 were alive during the events of the war as it was ongoing, but more on that in a moment. When looking at 2, I think he represents the curiosity part of the soul, as he is eager to learn about the things and explore, and he's innovative as well as creating tools and weapons for survival. Now looking at the twins 3 and 4, they are shown to be the memory, as they're nonverbal and they keep track of history, shown when they present what happened when they meet with 9, and they are keeping humanity's history preserved. Now with 5, this is the part of the soul I believe is for compassion and caring, and it's fitting, as he is kind of like a medic. He stitches up 9 at the beginning of the film and is always wanting to help his friends. Now with 6, I believe he is the scientist's beliefs and artistry, as he is also slightly visionary and knows about the talisman and what happens to those when they are sucked into it, as when 6 is present for 5's soul being taken by the machine, he sees their soul in the machine's lens and says they aren't gone. 7 is the courage, as 7 is a fearless warrior who has survived on their own and able to understand how to defeat the beast and fight. 8 is the strength, as he is the biggest out of the Stitchpunks and is the strongest. And finally, 9. 9 I believe is the will of the scientist, as 9 seems to have the drive to finish what was started, to bring back humanity any way he can, and nothing stops him from that. But what does this all mean? Well, now that we have a general idea of each of the Stitchpunks, I want to go over what I said earlier, about how Stitchpunks 1 through 8 were present during the events of the war, as one explains how mankind and metal went to battle. And the reason I bring this up is because it means the scientists created them during the war, sometime after the machine was built and taken, and before 9 was ever created. So the scientists' plan to save humanity was already in effect, and the talisman was already made. So what if the scientists continued to work with the Chancellor and added the component that allowed the machine to gain humanity, but before he could give up his soul, he made each of the Stitchpunks to separate it in case of it failing. And since it was during the war, sacrificing himself without proving it to be effective first, or when the machine was actively against humanity, his soul could have been taken and corrupted the same way the machine was. But if that's the case, does that mean all of the Stitchpunks were created in the intent of dying? This is where my theory hits a crossroads, as a scientist never states that the job of the Stitchpunks is to destroy the machine, or even destroy themselves. The only thing he says in his message to 9 is for him and the others to save humanity, as he demonstrates the talisman sequence and how to operate it. But it's left open as to what 9 is supposed to do with that. Yes, 9 learns how to use it after the events of majority of the film, but if it played out differently, what was the end goal? Well, I have two main ideas. The first being that when looking at the end of the film, 9 opens the talisman, setting free those they lost. 1, 2, 5, 6, and 8. And as their part of the scientist's soul reaches the clouds, it starts to rain, and inside soul fragments reside, symbolizing a rebirth of new life. The only thing is not all of them made it to those clouds, only a partial soul was used to make this, so parts of humanity is still technically missing, as 9, 7, 3, and 4 survived. So their parts of the scientist's soul never gets carried onto this rebirth, meaning it is possible those qualities of a soul are forever missing. So the scientists may be intended for them to use the device to release the soul from each of the Stitchpunks after the war was over, creating a new cycle of humanity, saving it. Or, with my second idea, going back and looking at the machine, since it has a slot for the talisman the scientists made, maybe the scientists intended for them to find that machine and become sacrifices so the machine can become complete with the human soul. But if it gains the soul, how does it guarantee that it will rebuild humanity? Well, that's the thing. These 9 Stitchpunks were essentially set up from the beginning, no matter what, as both ways we look at it, they were meant to be passed on. In the robot's case, it having no leader, no corruptor anymore, yes, it ended humanity, but considering that the fact it's built from the scientist's intellect, if we gave it the soul as well, it would technically be the scientist. And with all fractions of his soul, the machine may gain enough humility to know how to save humanity, and maybe build a new life that coexists with machines, one that truly brings peace, like it was intentionally made to do from the very beginning. And maybe because the scientist split his soul and the machine is observant, it can learn from each of the stitch punks as it gains each new part of the complete soul until it is fully complete. So the stitch punks were never made to survive. But what do you think? What was the scientist's plan? Have you ever noticed throughout the entire Coraline movie, her mother is wearing a neck brace? After rewatching the film, it stood out to me, and shout out to one of my commenters on the last theory that helped spark this whole idea. Because what if Coraline isn't just in a dream? What if she's actually in a coma? What if everything we see in the movie, the doll, the other world, the pink palace, and even her neighbors, are all made up in her mind as she's trying to survive in some sort of twisted nightmare, after the accident her mom casually mentions? And the more I thought about this, the more the pieces started to line up in a way that ran a chill down my spine. But before we go crashing into this theory like Coraline's family crashed into that truck, hit that subscribe button. It may just wake you up from your coma. At the beginning of the movie, after the Jones family moved into the Pink Palace, Coraline takes her dowsing rod and goes on to do some water witching, where she then has her first encounter with Wybie, who tells her the dowsing rod she chose isn't just a normal stick, it's actually poison oak. He then goes on to explain to Coraline about the well and the rumors surrounding it, as well as the history. The scene then cuts to Coraline looking out the window having a conversation with her half-paying attention mother, explaining how she almost died yesterday, and how they should go outside to do some gardening, but her mother thinks otherwise. But within this scene, an interesting detail flies right over most of our heads, including me the first 100 times I've watched this movie. Because Coraline's mom goes on to say, "But then we had the accident," as she points to her neck and there's a brace around it. And then Coraline goes on to reply and says, "It wasn't my fault you hit that truck." And I want to take a moment and dig deeper into that reply, because Coraline's body language and tone doesn't just sound like she is denying she had any part in it. It actually sounds like the complete opposite. It seems as though she feels some type of guilt connected to the trauma. I mean, it's something any child would feel seeing their parent hurt, especially if they truly link that trauma to it being their own fault. But why am I focusing in on that? Well, apart from this being one sentence of dialogue, it actually opens up an event that takes place before we even ever see the Pink Palace. Think about it. This accident occurred before they moved, and it caused enough damage for her mom to need a neck brace. This isn't just some tiny fender bender or a small tap on the bumper. It would have to be a decently sized accident to require some medical attention. So what if this accident didn't just hurt Coraline's mom? What if it caused injuries to the whole Jones family, potentially putting Coraline in a coma? But if Coraline is in a coma, what about the other world? The neighbors, the ghost children, and even Wybie? Well, if we use my previous theory about Coraline dreaming her way into the other world as a starting point, a lot of what I said there can be applied here. With my theory about her not being awake during the events of the movie, dreaming her way into the other world, accessing a dreamlike dimension, one I believe that the Beldam's world is built off of, the same rules would still apply. But with Coraline potentially now rooted in the accident, as it seems as though she was present for it, and with her now being put into a coma, she is still technically dreaming. Only now it's just one very long dream. Not a normal dream like you'd have scheduled for your regular 8 hours every night. No, this time the stakes are a little higher than just the emotional ties. It's now life or death. You see, Coraline's brain is now placed in survival mode. It's not as alert anymore because its main goal would be to stay alive. And that leaves an opening for one tragic thing. Because with this accident, the only other car described in the accident is a truck. And that's pretty broad, but if we go all the way back to the very beginning before we ever even see Coraline for the first time, there's one thing we do see: a moving truck. What if while Coraline's family was moving from Michigan to Oregon, they were unfortunately hit by the moving truck? And with Coraline's last thoughts being on how she doesn't want to move, that being later expressed in the film while looking at an old photo of her friends, and with her thinking about where she's going, the Pink Palace, her mind has just enough information to start filling in some gaps as she dreams. Enough information for the Pink Palace, her idea of the place, or even her neighbors. But what about Wybie and the ghost children? And most importantly, what about the Beldam? With Coraline filling in the gaps, building the version of the Pink Palace throughout her mind, I want to shift our focus firstly to the neighbors. Have you ever thought about how weird they are? I mean, look at Mr. Bobinski. He's an 8-foot tall blue man with skinny limbs and a big beer belly, who can do acrobats and talk to mice, and he even wants to train those mice for his jumping circus. It just seems so odd. But it's exactly someone a child would envision as their neighbor, somewhere they haven't been. Coraline's imagination is at full effect, and thinking about living with neighbors can spark endless ideas. And then looking at Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, they are also strange, as they are theatrical performers, dramatic, and obsessed with their dogs, something a child would envision for their other neighbors. And both Miss Spink and Miss Forcible actually play a much larger role for Coraline throughout the film, assisting her as the movie goes on. And I have some reasonings as to why. When Coraline visits them for the first time, we see that they are knitting outfits for their sick dog, as they have done so for the others that are already sitting on the shelf, stuffed. But those costumes are not ordinary. They are angel costumes, and I think that's important as it may not only be representation for the dogs, but also to Miss Spink and Forcible, as since they are aiding Coraline, they act like her guardian angel. And when Miss Spink reads Coraline's future, it warns her of a terrible danger coming toward, kind of like her brain is sending her a signal while she's in her coma, the protectiveness of staying alive. But they aren't the only ones who help Coraline. When taking a look at good old Wybie, he too helps Coraline toward the end of the film, when Coraline goes to destroy the key, but the Beldam's hands follow her, and Wybie helps Coraline break it, tying it up with the key, and ultimately tossing it down the well. But looking at Wybie, I think Coraline imagined him along with her neighbors. You see, when Coraline leaves Michigan to go to Oregon, she also is leaving behind her friends. And looking at the photo of them, they are both boys. Coraline would probably want another friend around her age, and since her previous friends were boys, Wybie is the perfect replacement for them. Along with this, Mr. Bobinski, Miss Spink, and Miss Forcible, and Wybie all have something that ties her to being in a coma. The fact that all of them, after meeting Coraline with a proper introduction, pronounce her name wrong. And that would make sense as they would never have met her, or even the fact of they aren't actually real. So if Coraline is stuck dreaming all of these people, where does the Beldam come from? Well, if Coraline is stuck in a coma state, the Beldam would have enough of an opening on a weakened mind to infiltrate. Because even though Coraline is dreaming about the Pink Palace and the people surrounding it, her last emotional thoughts would be focused on dread, how her parents didn't care for her neighbors wouldn't know her, and overall how old the house is. And that's shown throughout the film, as her parents ignore her, she doesn't get to do what she likes or as she was promised, and because of that, the Beldam is able to set up her trap for Coraline. And you might be asking why the Beldam would need to even have a little door, the mice, the doll, and all of these elaborate measures to get to Coraline if she's simply in a coma. And I asked myself that also. But considering that Coraline's mind came up with this world, the Beldam would still need to have some sort of gateway, one that requires Coraline to dream of another world. And with Coraline receiving that doll that looks exactly like her, something a child would dream of, and then thinking about the tiny door that's sealed off and what could have been there before it, then the Beldam is able to prey on Coraline's dream, building off of her curiosity, ultimately convincing Coraline to go to the other world, almost trapping her forever. So where does the ghost children come in? When taking a look at those ghost children, we see 3 different ones, all from a different era, past victims trapped inside the Beldam's world. And I believe that they are entirely real, not dreamt, not even tied to Coraline's coma. And I say this because when thinking about the Pink Palace, I think it does exist in the real world, just not in the same way we see Coraline envision it, because Coraline still knew where she was supposed to be going. She knew the name Pink Palace, she knew it was an old house, and it had other tenants. And if there was pictures, she probably saw it along with Mrs. Lovat, the owner of the Pink Palace, or even heard her parents talking to her or talking about it, and that was enough for her mind to build the dream version of the house. But the history around the house could still be real. There is a supernatural that seems to be tied to the other side. And I think that those ghost children were taken through their dreams of a better life and were lost forever. But one of those ghost children is Mrs. Lovat's twin sister. So how can that be? Just because I stated that Wybie can potentially be dreamt doesn't make Mrs. Lovat fictional. Again, if Coraline saw pictures, heard her name, then Coraline could have tied YB, her new friend, to someone she absolutely knows for certain is real and doesn't live within the Pink Palace. And when we think about the first time we hear Mrs. Lovett, it's strictly her voice. So maybe Coraline heard her parents having a conversation with her, heard her last name, and the fact she normally doesn't rent to people with children because her twin went missing there, making her sister's tragedy real along with the other ghost children. So if Coraline is really in a coma, if everything I've said is true, what does this mean for the end of the movie and Coraline's fate? After defeating the Beldam and returning to the happy dream, she could still ultimately spend the rest of her life in that coma, and it would make sense, because at the end of the film, the cat can still simply disappear, which shouldn't be possible. Or Coraline could still be under the Beldam's finger, as she waits for the next moment to strike Coraline again. But what do you think? Is Coraline even alive? Was any of this real? Or was Coraline in a coma? I just finished watching Paranoman for the first time since I was younger, and there's one thing I haven't seen too many others talk about. Something that completely changes how the witch's curse works, and how Norman even got his gift. But before we start waking up the dead and talking to ghosts, hit that subscribe button. It's free, and I promise it won't curse you like it did these zombies. In Paranorman, we meet Norman, a young boy who's outcasted by the town and looked at as strange, even by his own family. Because Norman isn't normal. He has the gift to talk to ghosts and the undead. But Norman isn't the only one in his family with this special gift. Norman has a great uncle who lives at the top of the hill by the old graveyard, Mr. Prendergast. And Mr. Prendergast has the same gift that Norman does, and we learn he has been watching Norman from afar, spying on him like some creep for years. And there's a reason for that. You see, every year to keep the witch asleep, someone with the special gift of talking to the undead has to read from a special book. But with Mr. Prendergast getting old, and with Norman now growing up, he has to shift that responsibility of reading from the book to Norman. You see, as Norman gets older, he starts to have these visions of the witch's curse, the past haunting him. And the only one who understands this is Mr. Prendergast. And he pops out of a toilet as a ghost after he unfortunately passes away, and tells Norman exactly what he has to do to prevent the witch's curse. And with my theory of the fact that the previous member has to pass away, it would explain how the gift passes on through generations and how it has to skip. Because why would Norman's family not possess the gift? His sister doesn't, his mom doesn't, and his dad most definitely doesn't have it. But why does Norman? And where did this gift even come from? About 3/4 into the film, we find out what the witch's name was. It's Agatha Prendergast. And if that last name sounds familiar, you'd be right, because that's the same last name as Norman's uncle, meaning that Agatha isn't just some random witch, she's actually Norman's relative from about 300 years ago. And the whole reason Agatha is called a witch in the first place was because she has the same gift as Norman. And unfortunately for Agatha, instead of just being bullied and outcasted by the town, she was put on trial and ultimately killed, being called the witch. A tragic death for an 11-year-old girl who didn't ask for any of this. But if Agatha had the same gift as Norman, how did Mr. Prendergast get it? And who had it before Agatha? When taking a look at the book entrusted to Norman to keep Agatha asleep, he gets confused while trying to read it. Because it isn't just some special book with another curse or even a spell, it's a children's fairy tale, a bedtime story. And going all the way to the end of the film, after Norman talks to Agatha and stops her reign over the town, she explains how she recognizes the tree and how her mother used to read her stories there. And that right there is a very important detail, but it leaves a lot of loose ends. Because if Agatha had the gift and was killed, how did the gift pass on through later generations? And who held the same gift before Agatha? And also the fact on how they knew to read Agatha's stories for the last 300 years. When looking at the gift itself, I made the bold claim about how the previous family member had to die before the next one takes the responsibility of the gift completely over, and how it would make sense as to why the gift seems to skip generations, but I could also be wrong. Because in Agatha's case, if she died before the next person with the gift was born, how did the gift survive? Well, there are a few possibilities. The first possibility is that Agatha is a direct parallel to Norman, meaning she could have a great aunt or great uncle who shared the gift and fully understood her, who kept her calm, who later could have had children who would go on and possess the gift for the next 300 years. eventually leading to Norman and Norman's great uncle. The second possibility is that Agatha's mother goes on to have another child after suffering from the grief of her daughter. The only problem with that theory is that the child wouldn't be old enough to keep Agatha asleep, as they would be too young to talk and even understand her, so it'd have to be someone either the same age or older, and Agatha never mentions having a sibling, so this is less likely. The third possibility is if my theory is right about the skipping generations, then maybe her mother's siblings had children and her mother asked them to read her stories as they passed it on until it reached Norman. The fourth and final one I'll mention, because to be honest they are essentially endless, is that Agatha's mom simply read to her through her grief at Agatha's grave, keeping her asleep by accident, and it would later become a family tradition. Because even though Agatha would be a ghost, it doesn't mean she wouldn't be able to hear her mom or a relative. And I know Agatha stated she hasn't seen her mom since her death, but if she was asleep, this would still make sense. So when or if Agatha's mom had more kids, or even Agatha's family fully took over the tradition, the gift could have came back and kept Agatha asleep up until Norman broke the cycle. And one thing that makes the most sense to me would be a mix of possibility 1 and possibility 4. As looking at Norman and Agatha side by side, they are made out to be direct parallels of one another with key differences. Both Norman and Agatha are 11 years old, and their gift is a burden to them. They are treated like outcasts, bullied, and in Agatha's case, she was ultimately killed. And with the possibility of both Norman and Agatha having an older family member with the same gift, who understands how it is, and how both Norman and Agatha are shown to be treated differently, with the key difference of Agatha seeking revenge to those who hurt her, while Norman always forgave them. And the end of the movie portrays that beautifully. But there is still one problem with this. There wasn't any responsibility to pass on to Agatha that we know of. So if the gift has to pass on generations to pass on the responsibility, what would Agatha's responsibility be, since we know Norman's is to keep Agatha asleep? Well, if we take possibility 4 seriously, then we can make sense of all this mess. Because if Agatha's mother read to her out of pure grief for her child without knowing of someone else possessing the same gift, it may have become the accidental tradition of the rest of the bloodline. And when Agatha's mother passes away, her dying wish would probably be to keep reading to her deceased child. So naturally it gets handed down to the next relative and the next for the next 300 years. And if we circle back to Agatha, she may have even been the first one in the family to talk to ghosts, as she was also the only one to be shown to have other abilities like lightning and even raising the dead. So what if when she cursed the townspeople to make them pay, that curse also caused her gift to be passed on until someone breaks the cycle? And that's why Norman has the gift, and even why his ancestors do, and why Norman breaks the curse. But if he broke the curse, why can Norman still see ghosts? Because even though the gift was tied to the curse itself, it doesn't just simply disappear. Because when Agatha had it, she had no responsibilities connected to it. So maybe it can still keep going through the next generations, or it could even stop with Norman himself. And when he eventually has kids and passes himself, the gift is gone forever. So what if Agatha was the beginning of the gift, her mom started a tradition, and Agatha's curse caused the birth of the gift through her bloodline, and Norman finally ended that 300-year curse? But I want to know, what do you think kept this gift alive for the last 300 years? Everyone remembers Coraline for the tiny door, the alive-feeling tunnel, and the world waiting to trap her on the other side. But Coraline's story doesn't start with the door or what lies behind it. It starts with the doll. More importantly, it starts with how the doll came into her possession. Because yes, Wybie gave it to her, but it opens up the question as to why he had to. Because before Coraline ever crawls through that tunnel, the doll watches her and helps the other mother build the perfect world to trap her in. But there's one issue. Coraline isn't the first person this has ever happened to. In the opening scene, we see a doll being pulled into the Beldam's world, where she tears it apart, removes the old features, and rebuilds it into the doll that looks exactly like Coraline Jones. But how did the Beldam summon it to the other world after so many years? And who does the doll represent? Later in the movie, we actually find out who that doll used to belong to. Wybie's grandma's twin sister, who disappeared when they were kids. And Wybie tells us how his grandma says she was stolen from them when they were young, showing how Mrs. Lovat knows the danger residing within the Pink Palace, and now she normally doesn't allow people with children to rent the place. But that raises the question, why allow Coraline and her family to move in if she knows the danger? After meeting YB, Coraline receives a gift left by him, a mini her. YB gives Coraline that doll, resulting in it snowballing into all of the following events within the movie. But why did YB have it? In the note he left with the doll, he explains how he found it and thought it looked just like her, so he figured she should have it. But if the Beldam was able to summon it to her world and make it look like Coraline, why not just place it within the Pink Palace for Coraline to find on her own? Why give it back to the Lovats? It makes me think that the doll was still connected to the Lovat family in some way. I mean, it's in their possession, and with Miss Lovat's exception for Coraline's family moving in, I don't think she forgot the danger. I think she was afraid for YB. Because we see YB hanging around the Pink Palace and the property a lot. With the doll being that close to him and with him being nosy, he could have stumbled into the Pink Palace, making him the Beldam's next victim. So maybe Mrs. Lovat was trying to protect YB, but by letting Coraline's family move in, she accidentally gave the Beldam something even better. A new child already inside the Pink Palace. With this in mind, I don't think the first scene takes place on the same timeline as we think it does, because even though it was shown as the first scene in the movie, if the doll was with the Lovats, the Beldam wouldn't know what Coraline would look like before she moved in. So how did she find out? I believe the Beldam sends Coraline through the well, because when Coraline is talking to YB, he gives the well's history. He says how people say if you fell in, you'd fall so deep, you'd see the stars. And like many other theories, I believe this is another gate into the other world. And with that gateway, Coraline may have been close enough for the Beldam to sense her, and the Beldam could have potentially used that to make the doll just like her. But the well still doesn't give the Beldam everything, it just helps her know another child is close enough to lure her into her trap. So the Lovats having the doll is still important, because even if the Beldam summoned the doll into her world, maybe she can't send it anywhere besides where it last had the strongest emotional connection, that being the Lovats. YB's grandma kept it because it reminded her of her twin sister. That strong emotional connection could be what was binding it to the real world, and to the Lovats. And maybe that's why she wants it back later within the movie, because it belonged to her sister, not Coraline. And that points to the timeline of the Beldam changing the doll to after Coraline is already within the Pink Palace. Because if it was changed before, Miss Lovat would have probably noticed that the doll no longer looks like her sister. So with the doll stuck with the Lovats and no sight on Coraline, the Beldam had to be creative. She used YB. After YB meets Coraline, she sends it back to the Lovats for YB to find and deliver to Coraline, making her form a new emotional connection because of it looking just like her. So now that the doll is no longer bound to the Lovat, it acts as the first step to setting up the trap for Coraline, because now the Beldam has eyes and can see what Coraline truly desires. So the doll isn't just as it appears. It's not just some creepy doll, and it's not just the Beldam spy. It's the object that connects everything within the movie. Miss Lovat's sister being taken, the old doll being brought back, YB getting too close to the Pink Palace, and Coraline's family moving in, allowing the Beldam to prey on her newest victim and having a way to watch Coraline's every move. Growing up, I've been surrounded by many films that felt like a fever dream to me. Movies like Coraline, Nine, James and the Giant Peach, and many, many others. And Where the Wild Things Are is no different. From getting the book read to me when I was young, to then seeing the very creepy movie released in 2009, this movie just hits a part of my brain that I can't even describe, and I believe many of us have completely forgotten about it. And after watching this film and reading the book for the first time in years, I have some theories to talk about, like what the wild things truly are and what Max's journey symbolizes. But before we start getting wild, hit that subscribe button as we let the wild rumpus start. Inside the movie, Where the Wild Things Are, we go through the journey of a boy named Max. And at the beginning of the film, he builds an igloo out of the snow all alone and wants his sister Claire to play with him, but she ultimately ignores him. And after a while, his sister's boyfriend arrives along with her friends, and Max sneaks around and starts a snowball fight that ends very badly as Claire and her friends end up breaking Max's igloo, causing Max to cry and rush into his sister's room, destroying a gift he made for her. Max then goes to his room where we see his drawings on the wall, creations which will be important later, and also a globe left to him by his father. His mom then shows up and says she would have said something unlike what his sister did, and some time passes as we see him playing in the schoolyard, sitting in class learning about the sun, and then we end up on the night where everything suddenly goes wrong. As Max goes downstairs after calling his mom to play Floor is Lava and being ignored, he oversees his mom on a date with someone, and Max doesn't seem happy. He then causes a ruckus and bites his mom and takes off into the night, regretting what he has done. But he no longer feels welcome in his own home. He feels alone. And this is where the wild things truly begins. As Max finds a boat, which I assume he made, and ventures out at sea for what looks like days and ends up on an island with some other monsters already there. After Max gets on the island, he observes a wreckage unfolding before his eyes, as a monster is breaking down huts in a fit of rage. Max then joins him, and we later learn more about each of the wild things and their names. We meet Carol, the main monster who was destroying the houses, KW, Douglas, Judith, Ira, Alexander, and the Quiet Bull. Max then becomes their king, and there is some dialogue here that is interesting as they say, "I like it better when we have a king. I like Carol better when we have a king," which implies there may have been another king, which I have an idea on who that could be, but more on that later. Max then makes the promise to keep the sadness away and forever have fun, and they all go out having wild adventures, and decide to build a home where they can all sleep in one big pile as a family. And throughout all of the adventures Max and these wild things go on, we see elements of, say, the real world, like a cat, a raccoon, and a dog that is gigantic for some reason. But I really want to focus on these wild things, because even if we take a look at the book, which is definitely different from the movie, the creatures are left unnamed and shown to be a thing of Max's imagination. In the movie, we get to explore deeper into the world of the wild and how each of these characters react to one another and how they truly feel, but majority of this film is still left unexplained. When taking a look at each of the so-called monsters, I actually believe they represent one of two things. They are either Max's internal emotions made physical, or they represent people in Max's life, which for today's video, we're going to focus on the emotion side, as each of the creatures feel more like a piece of Max rather than people surrounding him. However, the second idea is still very interesting, and perhaps in a future video, we can explore it while taking an even deeper dive into the rest of the film. For now, taking a look at the 7 monsters, I have an idea of what each of them represent as Max's emotions. Starting with Alexander, the goat-like creature, I believe he is Max's insecurity, as he is the tiniest of the monsters and is also often ignored, saying lines like, "Does no one ever hear me?" And it makes sense for him to be the tiniest in that case. Then taking a look at Douglas, the bird-like monster, I believe he is the emotions of loyalty and rationality, as even from the beginning, he is the one trying to keep Carol at bay, and is always trying to make sure everyone is organized, as when Max was breaking their houses, he only got mad at Max, not Carol, as it seems Douglas has his very own idea of rules in place. Then the pair, Judith and Ira. I think Judith represents selfishness, as she is very defensive over things and is also jealous, as when Carol and Max draw on the fort, she starts to feel like Max was playing favorites. And Ira, I believe, is the kindness and creativity, as he built things and punches holes in trees like art and digs the tunnel to the fort for everyone to use. Then the bull. He clearly represents Max's sadness and isolation, and he is more of a loner compared to the rest of the group, and is always quiet until the very end of the film. And now for the main 2 monsters, KW and Carol. I believe KW is Max's empathy and emotional maturity, as she isn't really destructive like the rest, and is shown to be the more mature one out of all of them. She also seems to symbolize the actions result in consequences, as when Carol was destructive, it pushed her further away. And finally, Carol. Carol is the one emotion that Max shows the most throughout the film. Anger, frustration, and impulsiveness. Essentially, Max's wild side. as he does want everyone to be a family, but when something doesn't go his way, he goes from 0 to 100 and becomes out of control, just like before Max took off and bit his own mother, even though it wasn't intentional. And putting all of these together, if we take a look back to when Max first arrived, he gets circled by all of the emotions, something scary. And if you think about him running away from home, all the emotions he would feel at once would be hard for a child to take control of. And now if we take a look at what I said earlier about how I may know who the previous king of these monsters were, and now knowing what each monster represents, it all starts to make a little more sense. When circling back to before we even meet the wild things, when Max is in his room looking at the globe his father left him, and also looking at the fact of him being angry at his mother being on a date with another man, I think that the previous king, the one who helped Max navigate his emotions, was his dad. And it makes the most sense as it's clear that his dad either passed away or his parents simply got a divorce. And with Max now left kind of on his own in his own household as he doesn't have his dad around, it allows his emotions to run wild. And when Max tries to fill in his father's role of being king, he doesn't fully understand how to at his young age. And the film seems to represent that perfectly. Another thing I want to talk about is the journey to and from the island of the wild things. As when Max runs away and when he goes back home, I'm assuming it's still the very same day, as when he runs away and when he runs back home, it is still nighttime. And I feel as though his mother would show more concern than what she did at the end of the movie. But looking at Max sailing through the sea, I think it symbolizes his emotional journey of maturity and control over himself. And looking at the book itself, it pretty much shows the same thing, as when Max in the book goes to where the wild things are and then tells them to go to bed without eating like his mom did to him, he was left lonely, wanting to be loved, and he sailed back home after smelling the food his mother made. So in the end, Where the Wild Things Are wasn't just a random movie like it first appears to be. Instead, it's about Max and him learning how to navigate his emotions and understand them, to understand himself. And maybe that's why this film hits so hard, because growing up feels like that island, so much chaos and trouble understanding the feelings you have. But in the end, you always eventually sail back to the place you call home. But what do you think about Where the Wild Things Are?